All right, guys, welcome to week 6 of the semester. I hope all's going well with you and yours. I just wanted to create this video to supplement the readings for this week a little bit, excuse me. And you'll probably hear my kids or wife yelling from the other room. I'm sneaking away to record this video for you while they do homeschooling stuff. So, what I want to do is give a quick overview. It's going to be really quick. I'll go fast, but I'll post this PowerPoint in the week 6 folder. Just an overview of some of the ideologies that are coming out of the 1800s on the heels of the Industrial Revolution. You guys have done a great job breaking down French Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. But all these things kind of lead to big ideas about how the world should work. And I want to talk a little bit about the modern era, because really from this point on, this is where historians really start calling history from this point, like after the Napoleonic Wars, after the Industrial Revolution gets kicked off, we start calling this the modern era. So really the last 200 years or so has been modernity. And we got here by way of the Enlightenment first, with these ideas about, really digging deep into ideas of how do humans coexist with one another, how do they prosper, what makes the best forms of government, how should society govern itself, what role does authority have in, creating liberty and freedom, and how much control do we have or should have over our own lives. That leads us to putting those ideas into practice with the French Revolution. But it didn't really go as peacefully as people might have wanted. It was kind of a disaster in a lot of ways. We get the rise of Napoleon. There's a series of wars that devastates Europe. Elsewhere in the West, the Americans are doing pretty well, but pretty soon, they start, having to struggle with conflicts over slavery and states' rights and things like that. But the underpinning of all this is the Industrial Revolution. We get much more efficient manufacturing processes. We get a transformation of urban spaces, shifting populations from the countryside to the city. And this creates a lot of prosperity for some people, but also just a ton of misery and suffering for other people, which you guys did a very good job writing about in your last analysis paper and for the exam. So all these things really mark the start of what we call modern history. And we can chart this from really the late 18th century, maybe the early 19th century, so like the early 1800s, all the way to the present day. And there's this wonderful old Nickelodeon cartoon that I grew up on called Rocko's Modern Life. And it was this really strange anthropomorphic animal world that attempted to, almost like Seinfeld, also in the 90s, tried to portray modern life as this weird, we're just trying to survive, we're trying to grapple with constant change. We don't quite understand the world that we live in anymore, because a lot of traditional ideas that we humans used to rely on are fading away. And people are struggling to find consistency. We're struggling to find what exactly holds society together. What exactly makes me as an individual grounded in modern life. I think there's a Netflix movie that you can watch on Rocco. Anyway, it's just a thing that I had to mention. But change from the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, change happens very, very quickly. Society is starting to transform itself radically from every other period in human history. Like, things look so different, we don't even recognize society anymore. And in some ways, we still don't, right? We're still trying to figure out the world that we're living in. Technology has completely transformed the way humans operate, from, the alarm clock getting up at a certain hour instead of waiting for the sunrise and going to bed with the sunset. Like, our lives are governed by the clock now more than ever as a result of industrialization. You could chart this all the way through locomotives, steam engines, cars, planes, trains, the internet, the smartphone. Technology has completely and continually transformed how we interact with the world. These technological changes impact the economy. They also impact our politics. And we'll focus more on politics today than anything. But basically, there are so many questions raised by fast changes in these three categories: technology, economy, and politics, that with all this rapid change, people gravitate, some people, not everyone, but people gravitate towards ideologies or kind of frameworks of understanding the world to try and find answers to these modern questions and modern problems of, like, what the hell is even going on anymore. One of these ideologies is socialism. Now, your book talks about this in a little bit of detail. I want to just overlay a couple of things on top of what the book says. We're in an election year, and our politics in the United States, more than ever, have kind of wrapped itself around this idea of socialism as either a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm not going to place a value judgment on that, but socialism is one of these ideologies that we're talking about. And it comes out of the 1800s. It's hard to define what socialism is. If someone tells you what the definition of socialism actually is, they're BSing you. Like, it's such a broad thing that takes many different forms. But the Dr. Schoner, History 101 simple definition of socialism, and you shouldn't necessarily trust me on this either, because it's overly simplistic. It advocates for public instead of private ownership of property and resources. That's basically what socialism is. It's more of a communal look at wealth and property rather than individual wealth and property, which can lead to massive inequality under capitalism. Socialism in general advocates for a restructuring of the market economy. It advocates for less of a laissez-faire capitalistic outlook on life, on how things work in terms of the post-industrial economy. It argues that without proper restrictions, capitalism does more harm than good. It causes more suffering than it does prosperity, especially in the long run. And that's certainly the argument that individuals were making at the time of the Industrial Revolution, which is where socialism comes out of. The idea here is that workers, which are most people, work on behalf of the elites, and the elites are able to siphon most of the profits from this labor to themselves, and they give the crumbs back to the many, to the workers, right? Now, you don't have to agree with this. This is just socialism's idea of the world, and it may not always be true. It may not always reflect reality, but certainly people during the Industrial Revolution felt that, if I'm working for literally pennies on the hour while my boss is a multimillionaire, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, that kind of distribution of wealth does more harm than it does good. It causes more pain than it does prosperity. So therefore, we need to reorganize society to a more social-centric system. In other words, socialism has in mind the collective good of society rather than letting individuals make obscene amounts of wealth while everyone else just has to fight for what's left. Again, I'm not advocating for this. You don't have to believe in it. I don't care what you believe. But this is one of these ideologies that comes from modern circumstances and modern questioning of, you know, how should we organize society in a good way? One of the earliest socialist thinkers was Charles Fourier. I think your book mentions him a little bit. He's a French philosopher. He is a big believer in social cooperation. You know, he's an optimist. He thinks human beings should and can work together to create a prosperous, fair society. He believes in, I guess, what we could call social justice today, even though that wasn't a term back then. Fourier believed that poverty is the main cause of society's problems. If we could alleviate poverty, we would get rid of a lot of the division and disorder in society, right? We would get rid of if we could abolish homelessness, abolish starvation and food scarcity, if we could, strengthen individuals on a communal level, if we could give everyone the means to get by and prosper, things like crime would largely disappear. Things like racism would largely disappear. Basically, poverty is the root cause of society's problems. Fourier advocated for minimum wage. There was no such thing as minimum wage until later on, but he's one of the first people to advocate that everyone should make a bare minimum wage that they can live off of fairly comfortably. And we would call this a living wage today, right? A lot of the policies of Bernie Sanders and people in that kind of vein of American politics believe in a living wage. And that's a very Charles Fourier idea. He also believed in maximum wages. Like, people aren't, you will not have Jeff Bezos in the world that Fourier wants. At least you'll have Jeff Bezos, but he will not be a multi-billionaire. No one should have that much wealth. No one should hoard that much wealth at the expense of people who are in poverty. It just doesn't make any sense, according to Fourier. So again, you can agree with this or not agree with it. But this is just what this guy is thinking. And he's pioneering early socialism. Your book talks about Robert Owen. This is more of a utopian socialism. I'm not going to spend any time on Robert Owen, but basically he tries to build this idealistic community in Indiana, my home state, called New Harmony, where everyone lives in peace and total equality. And for lots of different reasons, it just doesn't pan out. And so but it's an early experiment in utopian lifestyle where, I don't know, I don't want to dwell on it too much because it just doesn't go anywhere. He himself is not around to actually, he goes back to Britain and just kind of lets New Harmony take care of itself, which doesn't work because without the main guy with the main ideas there, it founders on the rocks. So that brings us to communism, which is one of the things I'm having you read for this week. Yes, it's your evil history professor twisting your minds, subverting the youth of America by making them read about communism. I find myself as a history professor under a lot of political pressure these days to not teach about this stuff, which is bullshit because it's important to know about these things. And I'm not advocating for them. Just because I'm teaching you about communism does not mean I'm a communist or I'm trying to make communists of you. So, with that little soapbox thing out of the way, Karl Marx is the main proponent of communism. Communism and Marxism are actually two different things, but for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to treat them we're putting them in the same bucket. Marx was born in Germany. He lived most of his life in England, which was the hot seat of the Industrial Revolution at the time. And he was hypercritical of capitalism in general. He saw it as this massive engine of exploitation of the lower classes. Now, this is different than socialism because socialism advocates for more fairness on behalf of the working class. Karl Marx takes it a step further. And he viewed himself as kind of a prophet that foresaw a workers' revolution coming down the line, which would overthrow capitalism entirely. It would create vast equality out of everyone. And his main tome, his main text that advocated for this coming workers' revolution was the Communist Manifesto that he wrote with Friedrich Engels. This is one of the documents for this week. It's just a few pages of the manifesto. It's not a long book. It's only like 50, 60 pages entirely. But you could read it in an afternoon if you really wanted to. But not only does the manifesto prophesy this workers' revolution where the workers going to take all the wealth in the world and divide it amongst themselves, it sees history in a unique way. This is Marxism. Marxism is looking at history through the lens of class struggle. So basically, history is this constant war between the haves and the have-nots. And the haves have been winning in every single period of human history. Marx is actually pretty critical of socialism because he doesn't see it as going far enough. If socialism wants to work within the confines of the Industrial Revolution, if it wants to work and just modify capitalism to make it fairer, Marx is like, no, we need a full-scale revolution by the workers in order to affect real change. And this is called communism. So Marxism and communism and socialism are all different things. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If they do, they are trying to sell you something, and they're lying to you, or they're just ignorant. Socialism and communism are different things. Communism is the version of socialism on triple dose of steroids, and it's quite frankly, way out there in left field. We also get anarchism, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but anarchism is kind of the opposite of communism and socialism, where they're seeking to abolish any form of authority that people build. Like individuals and maybe small tribes of people, that's where true authority should lie. But governments, factories, corporations, like all these, religion, all of these forms of authority are fake, and they're there to control you, and you should cast them off. So he's anti-capital. Anarchism is anti-capitalist. It's anti-government. It's anti-religion. Mikhail Bakunin is the main advocate of anarchism in the 1800s, and he thinks that once we are able to free humans from corrupt institutions, we would all get along better. But things like government and religion and the market economy, they've all warped us into becoming slaves of something that shouldn't exist. And they strip away our freedoms. He wants to return people to a state of nature. And Bakunin thinks the ideal form of government would be small tribes of people back, in the Stone Age, basically. That's when we had it best, was people could live in small communities, and that's the most effective form of human life. Nations and countries are also just really bad. They're bad constructs, and they're bad for people in general because they make you do bad things on behalf of those in charge of you. One last thing I want to talk about is nationalism. Nationalism means something different today. You hear this come out of a lot of right-wing news sources extolling the virtues of nationalism. It means something different today than it did back then. Back then, nationalism was this idea of people coming together who shared a common past, a common culture, and a common language, and this makes them a unique nation. Your national identity, so for example, being American, is more important than the other identities that you might subscribe to. This is what nationalism is. So it supersedes being man or woman or other. It supersedes education. What class of education or person or class group you fall into. Um, your locality, where you live, your religion, all these things are subservient to your loyalty to your particular nation. In its extreme form, nationalism can be a very dangerous thing. It's oftentimes an extreme right-wing rallying cry. The hyper-nationalism of the 1920s and 30s brought us World War II with hyper-nationalist governments in Italy and Germany kicking off a Second World War. We see nationalism coming back in the 21st century, which is kind of a scary thing. And nationalism today means my country is better than all other countries, and I deserve to have domain over other countries because they're inferior. My nation is so good, I deserve to conquer my neighbors, right? Or I can ignore international law, or the rules don't apply to my nation, but it applies to everybody else. So nationalism in its extreme form, this my nation is better than yours, we deserve things you don't have, or things we want like your land or your resources or your independence. Nationalism taken too far can be a very toxic thing. And this should not be confused with patriotism, which, everyone has patriotism, right? Just having pride in one's country or wanting your country to be a better form of itself. This is not the same thing as my country is better than everyone else's and we deserve to blow you up with bombs and take your stuff. So that's essentially what I'm wanted to talk about today. I hope this was useful to you in some way. For week 6, you have some discussion, not discussion, but some guided reading questions that you can take notes on. I hope these questions point you towards the main ideas of these historical documents in your Perspectives book. So you'll be reading this week the Communist Manifesto and also The Women of England from Sarah Ellis. This will give us an idea into the ideologies and the questions that people have as they enter the modern era. If you have any questions for me, feel free to email me or stop in during office hours. It's been great to see some of you guys that I haven't been able to see otherwise as you Zoom in during office hours. I'll try and get your exams graded as fast as I can. But in the meantime, I hope you're all doing well and hope that you all have a productive week. I'll see you later.